The Vietnam War in Intimate History is a sweeping narrative encased in a generously illustrated, large-format book which is meant to serve as an accompanying volume to the 10-part, 18-hour PBS documentary of the same title from historical series veterans Ken Burns and Lynn Novick. The book features poignant personal stories from practically every participant viewpoint of the Vietnam War. Troops from all warring sides, military leaders, politicians, war journalists, anti-war activists, and the families of soldiers and victims of the war. These stories are seamlessly blended with a solid and well-researched historical narrative formula of mixing solid historical narratives, including stories from the battlefield from grunts, officers, and generals who were in the thick of the conflict. While there is no new history in the book that cannot be found somewhere else, the expansive overview is compelling and sometimes touching, leaving much to be admired for any lover of history or human drama. Deja Vu, 1858 to 1961. Vietnam first became a nation in 1802 when a General Gia Long became the first single ruler of a country that emerged from 30 years of civil war. He would establish the Nguyen dynasty and become its first ruler. Vietnam patterned itself after China, their neighbor to the north in many ways: religion, architecture, government, down to the chopsticks they wielded. Even their civil service and education systems followed strict Confucian lines. The Nguyen dynasty ruled Vietnam until 1858 when 2 French missionaries were executed and France invaded and took over Vietnam as its colony. While France publicly stated that they would be benevolent caretakers of their Indo-Chinese subjects, they instead used local Vietnamese as cheap labor and domestic servants. France's rule provided very few benefits to 90% of Vietnam's population, who were mostly peasants. Locals who once owned their own land watched helplessly as the French turned their lands over to big landowners when they could not pay ever-increasing taxes and debt. Dissatisfaction with French exploitation gave rise to pockets of uprising, but factionalism and politics undermined any chance for locals to eject the French from their land. There were many nationalists, and one of the most persistent and vocal was a spindly Ho Chi Minh. The first brush that the United States had with future North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh was in Paris at the same time as American President Woodrow Wilson in 1919. 29-year-old Ho at the time called himself Nguyen Ai Quo, or Nguyen the Patriot, although his real name was Nguyen That Thanh. He would finally settle on being called Ho the Most Enlightened, or Ho Chi Minh, during his long, shadowy career where he would assume some 70 different identities. Ho was an ardent Vietnamese activist who took to heart Wilson's stated desire that a nation should be entitled to the principle of self-determination where they can control their future and destiny. Ho was agitated for his own Vietnam's little taste of self-determination, a colony of France since 1864. He was not exactly calling for France to set Vietnam free, but simply to provide indigenous Vietnamese a voice in the French Parliament. Ho Chi Minh, a nationalist at heart, also became an avowed communist after being colored by the writings of Vladimir Lenin, eventually founding the Indo-Chinese Communist Party in 1930. As a communist, the French considered him a fugitive, and Ho spent many years avoiding French authorities by assuming many identities and moving from one location to another. He eventually slipped into China, where he immersed himself in communist politics. When the Japanese overran French forces at the beginning of World War II, Ho found himself opposing another foreign invader, the Japanese. The Japanese installed a dictator, Bo Dai, to be a figurehead ruler, and they began to rule Vietnam with an iron hand, as they did with other Japanese captive countries in World War II. Ho Chi Minh then slipped back into Vietnam and merged different communist factions into the League for the Independence of Vietnam, or the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh began their crusade to convert communists by starting with the uneducated highlands people and eventually going from village to village, not only talking about the benefits of communism, but also helping native Vietnamese, especially in times of crises such as famines. Following the military defeat of Japan and the fall of Bo Day, in August 1945, the Viet Minh took over Hanoi and declared a provisional government while asserting national independence on September 2nd. Immediately after this, the first American fatality in French Indochina, Albert Peter Dewey, an officer of special services, precursor to the CIA operative, was killed by mistake by the Viet Minh on September 26. France, through its provisional government, sent French soldiers back into Vietnam to try to take back the country from the Viet Minh, resulting in the First Indochina War that went on for 9 years. Ho Chi Minh's position was significantly bolstered in January 1950 when China's Mao Zedong formally recognized the Viet Minh and supplied military training and hardware after Ho requested for help. In response, U.S. President Harry Truman in 1952 approved a $23 million outlay for the French efforts in Vietnam, a figure that would balloon to $100 million by the end of the year. This meant that 1/3 of the cost of France's war in Indochina was being borne by American taxpayers. After the Viet Minh defeated French-led forces in 1954, the Geneva Accords divided Indochina into 3 countries: Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, which was further split up in North and South Vietnam, divided by the 17th parallel. Pending elections, which were to be held in July 1956, a 300-day free movement period was allowed in which over 1 million people, mostly Roman Catholics, moved south. Before the 1956 elections, however, South Vietnam's Ngo Dinh Diem, the United States' little man in South Vietnam, overthrew Bo Dai with the help of his treacherous brother Ngo Dinh Nu, and proclaimed himself South Vietnam's president. It was now his South Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh's North Vietnam. For the next 9 years, South Vietnam would receive financial and military aid from the United States, even as emerging American legislator John F. Kennedy announced that he believed that South Vietnam represented Southeast Asia's cornerstone of the free world. Ngo and his brother established the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, in 1955. A military organization that would be the main local force in resisting the attacks of North Vietnamese forces. In North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh still harbored visions of a united Vietnam, and his communist state imposed communist China-style land grabbing in the guise of land reform. It was a ruthless effort that led to the deaths of over 15,000 people from all walks of life. His chief military advisor was a former railroad clerk, Le Duan, who, together with Ho, was thinking of how they could absorb South Vietnam using military force without necessarily executing a conventional invasion. They planned what would be the main tactic of North Vietnamese forces in the years to come: guerrilla warfare. Using their intimate knowledge of the contours and natural growth of Vietnam, they would slip platoons of about 50 soldiers across the 17th parallel, hacking a path through the mountains in Laos, which would infamously be known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Their infiltration led to the creation of bands of revolutionaries, which would have running gun battles with the ARVN from 1955 to 1960. However, the ARVN would have more meaningful activities in 1960, apart from playing cops and robbers with local reactionaries. On November 11, 1960, a few days after John F. Kennedy was elected President of the United States, disaffected elite troops of the ARVN attacked the Independence Palace in Saigon with the objective of overthrowing Ngo Dinh Diem and establishing a military government. While Diem was able to hold off the attackers, representatives of more than a dozen organizing political and religious parties were meeting to plan out how they could overthrow Diem with the help of the communists. In North Vietnam, the Politburo agreed that they would help in the effort. A new organization called the National Liberation Front, or NLF, would orchestrate the overthrow effort. Its enemies, the United States and the current regime in Saigon, would have another name for them: communist traitors to the Vietnamese nation, in short, Viet Cong. Riding the Tiger, 1961 to 1963. John F. Kennedy's first couple of years as the President of the United States was an omen of things to come for American foreign policy. He was unable to keep Russia from constructing the Berlin Wall in Germany in 1961, and a year later he failed to veto a CIA-inspired invasion of Cuba that ended in a disaster. He also was criticized for not committing U.S. forces to engage communist forces in Laos, defying the recommendations of ex-President Eisenhower. In Vietnam, things were worsening for the South Vietnamese regime as the Viet Cong were increasing their control of the Mekong Delta south of Saigon, which was South Vietnam's capital. It became extremely dangerous for Americans to travel outside of Saigon. The North Vietnamese enemy now had three components. First were the main force regulars reporting to the Communist Command Center, Central Office for South Vietnam, or COSVN, in the corner of Tay Ninh Province, barely 50 miles from Saigon. The second were the regional force companies who were under the control of district or provincial leadership. These were more educated, better armed, and more thoroughly schooled in class doctrine. Finally, the biggest component was civilian part-time militia, mostly farmers and their relatives who worked the fields in southern Vietnam. With the growing presence of the North Vietnamese forces in South Vietnam, the U.S. military advised Kennedy that 23,000 troops were needed to discourage the North Vietnamese from making any further advances. He initially refused, afraid that the U.S. will end up sending hundreds of thousands of Americans to Asia, and convinced that they would lose a war there, just like the French had done. Despite his refusal, the U.S. would send advisors to Vietnam, which would eventually number 16,000 by the end of 1963. These advisors came from a new military unit called the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MACV, which were chartered to teach the ARVN to fight and to accompany men into battle to act as military advisors. They were not supposed to engage the enemy in theory. The American effort also included deploying a chemical called Agent Orange, which would end up harming American soldiers later on in the conflict. The U.S. would also send in fearsome military hardware like helicopter gunships, which terrified the Viet Cong at the beginning of the conflict. This whole operation was codenamed Operation Beef Up, although the Kennedy administration tried its best to keep this from the American people and Congress. The administration also tried to muzzle American media reportage in Vietnam by issuing Cable 1006, a set of ground rules to the media. The media were not supposed to criticize President Diem or characterize the American troops as directing combat missions. Still, the American media, as epitomized by the New York Times' John Reston, concluded that the U.S. was embroiled in an undeclared war in Vietnam, something that everyone knew except the American people. Ngo Dinh Nhu, the brother of the South Vietnamese president, appeared to be taking the initiative in wresting back some influence that the North Vietnamese had with the rural population by starting the Strategic Hamlet program. The main aim of the program was to win loyalty for the South Vietnamese regime by building a sense of community, encouraging self-sufficiency, and building new schools and clinics. The U.S. believed that the program was winning the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese. Hanoi was alarmed at the rapid spread of strategic hamlets, which had cut into the recruitment and logistical support by South Vietnamese peasants. Coupled with the initial success of Operation Beef Up, they needed immediate assistance. Ho Chi Minh quickly went to China to seek assistance from Beijing. Despite having already committed massive armament supplies to North Vietnam, Ho convinced China to resupply 230 more battalions. This development was not known in the U.S., where U.S. Defense Secretary McNamara believed that once a fully trained local civil guard and ARVN were engaged in hunting down communists, North Vietnamese military potential could be eliminated within a year's time. He ordered the Pentagon to plan for a steady reduction of U.S. assistance over the next 36 months. He was telling reporters that quantitative measurements taken by field operatives showed that the United States was winning the war, unaware that many ARVN operatives were supplying false statistics just to please the U.S., and keep the military assistance going. It seemed to most Americans that the U.S. was achieving its objectives of developing an independent and stable non-communist regime in South Vietnam. On the ground and on the countryside, however, the opposite was true. The Strategic Hamlet Initiative was in reality not winning the hearts and minds of bewildered peasant families who were forced to leave their homes as they were being resettled. In some areas, soldiers were burning villagers' huts and hauling the families off to government strategic hamlets which had very little infrastructure to support even a peasant lifestyle. While some families moved voluntarily for $20, many were forcibly rooted from their homes and farms. Many simply fled to the jungle and joined the NLF, a complete reversal of the desired pacification objective of the United States. Ngo Dinh Nhu, the chief architect of the Strategic Hamlet program, was increasingly being despised by American officials and observers in Saigon. They saw him as a brutal political infighter whose appetite for power was only as voracious as his wife's one. Nhu was easily the most detested personality in South Vietnam. His brother, the president, was all in as far as supporting the Americans' desire to save the country from communism, but his first concern was how to stay in power, which compromised his decision-making. Another problem was that the ARVN increasingly depended on the U.S. forces' armaments and on the field military assistance, seemed reluctant to move against the Viet Cong, who, while seemingly poorly organized and equipped, were much more knowledgeable about guerrilla tactics and fighting in the dense, tropical terrain. The battle in Ap Bac bore this out. The Viet Cong withstood the U.S. equipment advance of the ARVN and had battled the South Vietnamese to at least a draw. The Communists now believed that they had the ability to defeat a South Vietnamese army that had significant support from the U.S. It was a huge moral victory for the Viet Cong and a huge letdown for American forces and policymakers. Given these troubling developments, Kennedy was advised that the United States was no closer to victory in South Vietnam than at any time in the past. With President Diem losing his grip on the countryside and control over his incendiary brother, the outlook seemed very precarious. Things turned from bad to worse when a Buddhist monk set himself aflame on Wesi Day, the traditional birthday celebration of Buddha. Urban critics, disaffected Catholics, and intellectuals joined Buddhists in protest against Diem's increasingly repressive regime. Rather than take a conciliatory tone, Diem and his brother threatened to ratchet up arrests and prosecutions. By November 1963, disaffected members of the ARVN had started the process to overthrow the rule of Diem and Nhu. The rule of Diem and Nhu. On November 2, 1963, the Diems were captured and killed, and a new regime was installed. Less than 3 weeks later, U.S. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Texas, leaving the fate of 16,000 American advisors and American policymakers in Vietnam in the hands of the new American president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. The River Styx, January 1964 to December 1965. Lyndon Johnson started his presidency like a man on a mission, with over 200 items of major legislation: Medicare, Head Start, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and federal aid to education, with the end in mind to create his great society by starting a crusade to end poverty. While he had great momentum on domestic policy, he was not as confident on foreign affairs. He retained most of the advisors that John F. Kennedy had hired in his administration. The political situation in South Vietnam when he took over as president was not good. While the South Vietnamese were embroiled in infighting and bickering, the Viet Cong were succeeding in knocking down one South Vietnamese strategic hamlet after another. By the end of 1965, Viet Cong had effective control of 40% of South Vietnam, who watched as Catholics and Buddhists clashed in the streets, further dividing the populace. General Con, who took over the South Vietnam government in January 30, 1964, with a group of young ARVN officers, would be forced to reform and reconstitute his government 7 times. It was also becoming clear that top military leaders were lying to the US government about how well the war was going, and Americans were being led astray with manufactured, cheery statistics. The country's military leaders, Air Vice Marshal Nguyen Cao Ki and Army General Nguyen Van Thieu, were widely recognized as absolutely the bottom of the barrel. In the meantime, First Party Secretary Le Duan, slowly taking over the North Vietnamese leadership mantle over to Ho Chi Minh, was convinced that it was about time to make a big strike. To prepare for this, Le Duan began to systematically purge their party of those who disagreed with them, and were called revisionists and rightists, who were imprisoned, dismissed, demoted, and even sent to re-education camps. A clandestine disinformation and sabotage effort by the CIA was also not yielding any results, and nothing was ever heard of from CIA-trained commandos that slipped into Vietnam. To increase the pressure on the Viet Cong, President Johnson authorized to increase the number of U.S. advisors to 23,000 from 16,000 by the end of 1964. He also made an important decision in 1964 when he appointed the highly decorated and acclaimed General William Westmoreland to be the commanding general of the U.S. forces in Vietnam. The war was accelerated in the Gulf of Tonkin in August 1964 when a North Vietnamese torpedo boat fired and missed at an American destroyer, the Maddox. According to most sources, it was Le Duan who ordered the attack. The Joint Chiefs of Staff urged retaliation, and just a week later, the U.S. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which committed even more troops and military artillery to Vietnam. A few weeks later, American pilots dropped bombs on North Vietnamese military installations for the first time. Senator Barry Goldwater, Johnson's Republican opponent in the upcoming presidential election, increased the pressure on Johnson and challenged the president that he should admit that the United States was already in a de facto war in Vietnam and the United States should go ahead and try to win it. Despite Goldwater's challenge and increasing commitment of U.S. forces in Vietnam, Johnson won re-election in a landslide. Le Duan planned a new tactic. He was going to draw South Vietnamese forces away from their main bases and attack them from all directions using their knowledge of the jungle and mountain topography. Together with their hold on many of the villages, he felt that he could encourage a local uprising to support his eventual invasion of Saigon and the rest of South Vietnam. Johnson got information that North Vietnam was on an aggressive path on January 27, 1965, barely a week after his inauguration, that North Vietnam had significantly reinforced and resupplied the Viet Cong. At this point, Johnson faced two options. One, try to continue to get some kind of settlement, really a surrender, or two, use American military might to send North Vietnam a message that it should have to live with a North and South Vietnam. By the advice of McNamara, Johnson opted for the aggressive military option. On March 2, 1965, the United States unleashed Rolling Thunder, a systematic bombardment of North Vietnam. This assault would go on for 3 years, on and off, where the U.S. would drop nearly 750,000 tons of bombs in 1 million sorties. The growing American involvement and the relentless bombing attacks did not intimidate Hanoi. Instead, North Vietnam, through Le Duan, promised that we will fight and separately convinced Russia and China, who were drifting apart, to supply Hanoi with significant offensive and defensive military capabilities. China would send over 300,000 to serve in North Vietnam to fight the South Vietnamese and Americans. By May of 1965, the Viet Cong were taking out what was essentially 1 battalion each week. Sensing that Saigon seemed just a few weeks away from completely collapsing, General Westmoreland requested for more troops to bring the total to a staggering 175,000, with permission to deploy them into battle at any time. Totally flabbergasted and lost, Johnson convened an unofficial, multidisciplinary brain trust called the Wise Men to provide counsel. It was comprised of John McCloy, the former American pre-consul in occupied Germany, Arthur Dean, who had helped negotiate an end to the Korean War, General of the Army Omar Bradley, and Dean Axon, Harry Truman's Secretary of State. Their consensus was to continue with the aggressive posture and to continue to commit more men when necessary. Johnson sent 50,000 more men and promised another 50,000 by the end of 1965. It was now clear that American troops were no longer advisors, but the participants in a war against a foreign power. The Americans still tried to make it seem like the ARVN, with over 500,000 men, were capable enough to secure the countryside, while the Americans, with their advanced artillery and expertise, would take care of the big boys, or the main Vietnamese force. Westmoreland planned that after weakening North Vietnam's main forces, the war could be completed by the end of 1967. His optimism was also reflected in how much time a soldier spent in Vietnam. Thinking that the war would be over in a couple years, he required only a 1-year tour of duty for each soldier. While this was good for morale and public relations, it was not good for combat. New soldiers meant less experience and less solidarity and camaraderie, which further meant that soldiers were less effective in combat, putting their lives and those of other American soldiers in danger. The U.S. government would continue to try to shape the narrative of the real situation on the battlefield. When Morley Safer of CBS showed television images of frightened old people and crying children in the midst of their burning huts set afire by American Marines, an irate President Johnson called CBS President Frank Stanton and said, "Frank, are you trying to fuck me?" The American diplomatic and military leaders in Vietnam could not help but admire the cohesiveness of the North Vietnamese forces, which was head and shoulders above the ARVN. However, the most impressive aspect of the enemy was the emotional and vocal commitment of its troops all the way down to the lowest soldier, for sacrifice to the communist cause. In September of 1965, thousands of such committed soldiers poured through the Ho Chi Minh Trail into the central highlands of South Vietnam. As opposed to the reluctant ARVN, North Vietnamese combatants were eager to fight the Americans for the first time. An American major went as far as to say that the Viet Cong were the most dedicated soldiers he had ever seen and would give anything to have 20 Viet Cong under his command. The Viet Cong, which had a huge disadvantage in weaponry and aerial firepower, realized that the best way to fight the Americans was to get into practical hand-to-hand combat and to grab him by his belt. The Viet Cong hoped that this would greatly reduce the significant advantage of American air power. In November 1965, the first major battle between the United States Army and the North Vietnamese Army, instead of Viet Cong guerrillas, was waged in the Battle of Le Drang. The North Vietnamese displayed their ferocity and grit, applying the grab-him-by-the-belt philosophy and signaling to the United States forces that North Vietnam was no pushover. Only an aerial assault by helicopter gunships saved the Americans from total annihilation. Chastened by the reality that the North Vietnamese were formidable foes, General Westmoreland asked for 200,000 more troops, a request that was a shattering blow to the Johnson administration. Johnson tried to put up a brave face and announced to the press that, "We have stopped losing the war, but knew that the war would be a long-drawn one for a long time." Johnson abandoned all dreams for a short war and devoting full-time attention to his domestic policies. He admitted that his administration had been too optimistic and ordered the deployment of troops in accordance with Westmoreland's request. Resolve: January 1966 till June 1967. With over 2,800 American dead and 200,000 troops stationed in Vietnam, President Johnson on January 31st, 1966 announced that the United States was going to resume the bombing of North Vietnam. It would have to go at it alone, however, as its most important friends, Italy, Canada, France, and England, did not want to participate in any military action and instead called for peaceful negotiations. The United States, looking for political stability in Vietnam, summoned two officials, Nguyen Cao Ky and Nguyen Van Thieu, who led a junta that seized power the year before to meet President Johnson in Honolulu. Johnson laid out his plans for the two men jointly to undertake social and political reforms in their country. There was no time to waste. By the end of 1966, it was estimated that the communists had control of almost 75% of South Vietnam. Westmoreland wanted to increase the number of people living in secured areas and the number of roads available for safe passage, and wanted to complete his objectives in less than 2 years. By then, he believed that his forces would have reached the crossover point where the ARVN and U.S. forces would be killing North Vietnamese forces faster than they could be replaced. In the mainland, Senator William Fulbright was convening hearings to determine what was really going on in Vietnam. Before the hearings began, General Westmoreland on January 28, 1966, sent 20,000 American, South Korean, and South Vietnamese troops across South Vietnam to look for the enemy. In the process, the American-led forces razed villages and destroyed property, looking for anything that evidenced support of communists. Thousands were forced from their homes, while hundreds of civilians were caught in the crossfire. Some American soldiers realized that they were not winning any friends with their tactics, but they were just terrorizing the peasants. They felt strongly that the South Vietnamese just wanted the war and the Americans to go away. Where they weren't destroying property, they left the locals with tax collectors and long-absent landlords that squeezed as much rice and rent money out of the tenant farmers. After these bloodsuckers left, the communists came back and took control over the areas again. Unlike the previous wars, it was almost impossible to determine whether American forces were winning or losing. Ultimately, Vietnam commanders agreed on a grisly way to measure progress: body count. This method to measure success lent itself to all sorts of abuse and excesses. People reported numbers that exceeded actual numbers killed. However, the more macabre result is that the objective was to kill as many soldiers as they could, rendering other mission objectives less important. The rule was if a corpse was Vietnamese, it was the enemy and counted toward the body count. While the Americans were obsessing about body count, the Viet Cong were figuring out how efficiently to move troops and military equipment from North to South Vietnam with minimal detection and exposure to American bombardment. It was able to secure landing and supply routes on Cambodia's coast from that country's leader, Norodom Sihanouk, who was supposed to be a neutral party. Supplies were trucked to what came to be known as the Sihanouk Trail. The much more infamous supply and transport route, however, was Route 559, or more commonly known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was praised as a marvel of organization even by American commanders. It provided food, rest stops, and materials for transport personnel who were resupplying the Viet Cong almost round the clock. Despite the relentless air attacks, the rate of infiltration steadily grew from an average of some 1,500 soldiers every month in 1965 to 6,000 a month 2 years later. The North Vietnamese who voluntarily went to war were prepared to not come back alive. They were given the 3 delays ultimatum: don't fall in love, marry, or have kids. In the United States, on the other hand, soldiers were chosen based on a selective draft. Over 8.7 million draft-age men would be part of the United States' armed forces during the Vietnam War. Most were volunteers, but half of the men who came of draft age during the Vietnam War tried to avoid military service through deferments and exemptions. In addition, 1 million young men would find a safe haven in the National Guard and the reserves, knowing that they would never be sent off into combat. These guardsmen and reservists were much better off than other draftees, and were overwhelmingly better connected and white. Originally calling for exclusively young and single men, the draft expanded as the United States' need for armed combatants rose. After 1966, the United States began drafting married men, and eventually, married men needed to have children in order to be exempt. Project 100,000 was also instituted to increase the pool of draftees by lowering the physical and mental standards for applicants. About 80% of the men drafted came from poor or working class backgrounds, as the rich and entitled were able to use their connections to stay home. For example, less than 5% of the 1970 graduating class from Harvard would serve in the war. Others who were not as connected applied as conscientious objectors or moral or religious grounds. Still, others tried to look sick and unhealthy to elude the draft. Many more young men trying to avoid the draft joined the anti-war movement and began protesting loudly against the war. The result of this selection process meant that Vietnam War soldiers were heavily skewed in favor of the underprivileged and minorities. A large percentage of draft-age black men were drafted because draft boards were overwhelmingly white and most of the draftees came from poor communities. Seeing that they could make at least $55 each month in combat pay. As a result, of the 240,000 draftees inducted between 1966 and 1968, over 40% were black. The difference in commitment and zeal of the combatants of North Vietnamese and Americans were big reasons why McNamara commissioned the Rand Corporation to figure out what made the Viet Cong tick. The results of the Rand study were alarming as the top deputies characterized the Viet Cong as a resilient and committed enemy who would only be vanquished at enormous costs. The study results would be validated in 1966 while South Vietnam was struggling to get a semblance of a civil government established with Nguyen Van Thieu and Air Vice Marshal Nguyen Cao Ky. The enemy's number continued to rise as supplies and men continued to stream in through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. There was no sign of Westmoreland's crossover point on the horizon. Meanwhile, South Vietnamese were trying to make sense and also trying to come out from under the rubble from the American bombs. Many South Vietnamese would actually spit at American trucks, yelling for the soldiers to return to America. It was clear to many soldiers that the South Vietnamese did not want the U.S. in their country, making many soldiers wonder why the U.S. was even in Vietnam. Back in the United States, the anti-war movement was gaining momentum in numbers and in militancy. It got a huge boost when black civil rights leader Martin Luther King characterized U.S. involvement as wrong and joined in a Manhattan demonstration with over 400,000 war protesters. In 1967, Westmoreland again reported falsely that the infamous crossover point had finally been reached and that he was confident of the United States winning the war. The U.S. ambassador to Vietnam, Ellsworth Bunker, disagreed. He noted that after 10 years of U.S. involvement, a huge swath of the country was still in Viet Cong hands and were very capable of committing acts of terrorism in even the most secure areas. Bunker added that much of the Viet Cong infrastructure that was the target of intense U.S. bombing still existed in the country. As he was asking for another 200,000 troops, Westmoreland told President Johnson that the U.S. would be able to turn the war over to South Vietnamese forces in 2 years. Robert McNamara, however, was becoming less and less sure of the ultimate success by the United States as the enemy continued to absorb whatever pounding that the United States could dish out. Johnson now worried that the American public and the rest of the world would start to look at the U.S. involvement as imperialist bullying. What we do. July to December 1967. Before the summer of 1967 rolled in, tens of thousands of American soldiers were lined up to be deployed to Vietnam in addition to the already close to 500,000 already in the country. Americans had come up with names for the Vietnamese, foe or friends. Gooks, slopes, and dinks, all derogatory labels that indicated that all Vietnamese were bad or inferior people. New soldiers were taught to shoot anything that moved, which resulted in many friendly fire casualties. The new American troops landed in a strange country with these strange foreign people and experienced new sights, sounds, and smells that only drove home the fact that they were so far away from home. This was worsened by the reception and the attitude that South Vietnamese had towards their so-called liberators and protectors. Americans were acting like the once hated French imperialists. They relegated the Vietnamese to become interpreters, translators, maids, cooks, prostitutes, and bar girls. North and South Vietnamese were beginning to look alike to American soldiers who were becoming paranoid about differentiating between friends and enemies. Some soldiers were later on discovered to have raped young girls, alienating them further from the South Vietnamese. While American soldiers were getting embedded among their reluctant allies, North Vietnam Commander Le Duan realized that his aggressive strategy towards South Vietnam caused the United States to accelerate their intervention, especially their feared bombing raids. This put stress on North Vietnam's ability to continue its incursion into the South. North Vietnam's two communist sponsors, China and Russia, already at odds with each other, had divergent views on how North Vietnam should proceed with the conflict. Russia wanted Hanoi to work towards a negotiation settlement, while China wanted North Vietnam to continue the conflict no matter how long it took. Hanoi would follow China's wishes and take a combative stance, and a plan was quickly put into place. This attack would consist of a first phase where National Liberation Front, or NLF forces, would combine with the main force North Vietnamese units to do scores of attacks on military bases and South Vietnamese cities. A second phase would rely on South Vietnamese civilians joining North Vietnamese forces and attack South Vietnamese positions. Le Duan theorized that these two initiatives would not only wipe out the South Vietnamese forces, but also horrify people in the United States to make them demand the government to pull out of Vietnam. This would be part of North Vietnamese hubris, which they would pay for severely down the road. However, even while the date for this attack was still unknown, by the end of the summer of 1967, thousands of North Vietnamese regulars disguised in civilian clothes began their movement towards South Vietnam to join tens of thousands of North Vietnamese and NLF forces already settled into their various camps. To prepare for their battle against the North Vietnamese forces, the MACV partitioned South Vietnam into 4 zones. Where they expected most of the fighting would be Zone 1, comprised of the northernmost areas of South Vietnam. By the summer of 1967, Americans were fighting in all of them. For General Westmoreland, a crucial aspect of his strategy was to find and destroy the North Vietnamese, and he wanted more troops for this effort. In the meantime, Robert McNamara tried to help the forces by authorizing the construction of 50,000 miles of barbed wire containing electronic sensors to be placed below the demilitarized zone, or DMZ, to detect North Vietnamese advances. The ambitious scheme, called McNamara's Line, would cost between $3 to $5 billion and then turned out to be a total waste of taxpayers' money as the North Vietnamese routinely evaded detection. Also hampering the United States' effort was the unreliability of the newly issued M16 rifles, whose design flaw required constant cleaning. In the middle of gunfights, the gun would often jam and endanger the lives of the U.S. troops. In contrast, the Russian-made AK-47s of the North Vietnamese forces seemed indestructible, giving the North Vietnamese a decided advantage in field battles. Aside from basic weaponry, 2 realities of the war also made absolute victory a distant notion for American soldiers. First, North Vietnamese had a rabid desire to succeed in killing opposing forces, showing their willingness to die in sacrifice. American commanders and soldiers were both dismayed and amazed by the resiliency and grit of the enemy. Second, American soldiers ended up returning to places which they thought they had already captured, then finding out that they have to risk their lives for a second time because the enemy had recaptured them. Back in the United States, President Johnson sadly realized that the United States would not be capable of simultaneously fighting his war on poverty and the Vietnam War. As inflation rose, he proposed an income tax of 10% to pay for the war. However, perhaps what was more painful was the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not appreciably improve the plight of less advantaged Americans. These did not sit well with the American people, and for the first time, a majority of Americans polled did not approve of the president's handling of the Vietnam War. Worse, 4 out of 10 Americans questioned why troops were even sent there in the first place. Despite the gains and advances made by the Viet Cong, General Westmoreland insisted that the Americans and South Vietnamese were winning the war. His assessment defied all the evidence. The war cost the United States $2 billion a month. There were 75,000 wounded, which amplified most noteworthy statistic, 13,000 dead soldiers. A big problem was that more Americans were inserted into combat, the ARVN troops became more dependent on them, became less competent, and had less confidence in their abilities. Before the year was over, there would be 500,000 more Americans in Vietnam. The American press began to ask more questions and become more critical of the questionable battle results. They also questioned the ability and integrity of the South Vietnamese government, which seemed more incompetent and corrupt. Johnson was livid at the press and scolded them to get on the team. Johnson was angry not only because the public was getting a daily dose of bad news, but also because the presidential campaign was about to start. Later on that year, Vietnam would have its own presidential elections, and Nguyen Van Thieu would muscle past Nguyen Cao Ky for leadership of South Vietnam. Neither of the men was considered to be the ideal leader by experts and observers. In the fall of 1967, the NLF and North Vietnamese early fall of 1967 began a series of attacks on American forces right along the Cambodian border, right below the DMZ, in what would infamously be remembered as the border battles. The bruising conflict involved heavy bombing and shelling of North Vietnamese installations, which led to the death of over 2,000 North Vietnamese personnel. It was also in these battles where nature and circumstance conspired to provide the most misery. Monsoon rains flooded the trenches, ruined supplies, and made life a living hell for the soldiers. In the United States, a different fight was being waged. Anti-war demonstrators decided that they would shift their protest action to one of resistance. Jerry Rubin, a major leader of the anti-war crowd, vowed to shut the Pentagon down. For the first time, protesters would confront active-duty military people to bring the point home that the government was the enemy. President Johnson, with a presidential campaign looming, was sure that the North Vietnamese, China, and Russia colluded with protesters. The CIA, who was aided by Johnson to investigate his suspicions, found no evidence that there was collusion. General Westmoreland and McNamara had widely differing opinions on how the war was being waged. Westmoreland insisted that the war was being won and that Americans should be subject to a media blitz, that there was no stalemate. He said that the U.S. should continue their bombing of the enemy. McNamara, on the other hand, was getting disillusioned by the lack of American progress. He bristled that it was now being called McNamara's War, and tried to convince the president that the United States should consider coming clean with the American people about the difficulties the American troops were having. He urged Johnson for the U.S. to stop the bombing and pursue negotiations. Ultimately, Westmoreland won out, and as the Americans were being told that they were winning, the bombing raids intensified. His approach worked, at least politically, as over 60% of Americans polled said that they favored escalating the war instead of limiting it, as McNamara had asked. While most Americans still disapproved of the president's handling of the war, more than 60% favored further escalation over reducing America's effort, and Westmoreland gladly indulged them. Things fall apart. January to June 1968. By the beginning of 1968, Le Duan was plotting for his big general uprising. Tens of thousands of main force North Vietnamese had already crept into South Vietnam, together with tons of smuggled Chinese and Soviet-made armaments in all manner of stealthy packaging, including coffins and flower carts. They were also weaponizing thousands of seemingly regular men and women to be sappers who would help ease the way for the conventional soldiers who were following right behind them. Unaware of these burgeoning preparations by Hanoi, General William Westmoreland asserted that since the enemy did not win a single major battle in 1967, things were on the upswing. He further assured them that the U.S. forces would be able to sniff out potential offensive actions by the enemy. With over 10,000 civilian and military intelligence officers in South Vietnam, there was a ton of data that was being processed, which yielded some information, but the sheer volume of the data was impossible to analyze. Right after midnight on January 21, 1968, the North Vietnamese started a diversionary attack in Khe Sanh in Quang Tri, just south of the demilitarized zone. They pounded ARVN and American forces to draw troops and equipment from areas where they were going to launch their big offensive. The Khe Sanh battles accounted for a big chunk of media reporting in the first half of 1968, bringing the ferocity of the war into the living rooms of the American people. Khe Sanh was the big attack that Westerlund was expecting, as the North Vietnamese hoped he would, and the ARVN and U.S. forces congregated there for a massive assault. It was an assumption that would lead to a lot of losses. However, in North Vietnam, Le Duan was making his own erroneous assumptions as well. He was counting on two things to happen for the coming offensive to succeed. First, the South Vietnamese government had to collapse under the weight of the pressure of the attack, and second, the people of the southern cities would abandon their government and join the Hanoi Revolution. He said that the big invasion would be an opportunity that comes once every 1,000 years. The big attack was set for midnight of January 31st, the night between the first and second days of Tet, the New Year's celebration, which was the most important holiday on the Vietnamese calendar. This meant that most of the ARVN soldiers would be at home celebrating the holiday with their families. The North Vietnamese enthusiasm was bubbling over, feeling that victory was certain. They were certain that current issues in supply and logistics would be easily overcome. They also kept the date of the attack known only among the top commanders to prevent any leaks from reaching the South Vietnamese. Because of confusion about the timing, the big attack finally came after midnight on January 30th, 1968, 24 hours before the original planned time. Between midnight and 3 a.m. on January 30th, a full 24 hours before the agreed-upon jumping-off time, the communists attacked and shelled 7 cities and towns, including Da Nang. The Tet Offensive's main thrust started 24 hours later, with over 80,000 North Vietnamese and NLF combatants hit 5 of the 6 biggest cities in the country. Dozens of American and ARVN bases, 50 hamlets, and 36 out of 44 provincial capitals would also be attacked. Their goal was to shake the earth, split the sky, and intimidate the enemy with overwhelming force. Many American soldiers agreed that it felt like Pearl Harbor all over again. American intelligence officials would later admit that there was a massive intelligence failure. The Americans had no idea of the location, time, and scope of the big attack. What they expected least of all was an attack on the capital of Saigon, which the North Vietnamese thought was central to the success of the attack. However, it wasn't only the Americans and the ARVN who were caught off guard. The Viet Cong, who were trying to creep into South Vietnam, were practically wiped out by military artillery, airstrikes, and gunships. The North Vietnamese had also more go wrong than go right as they tried to go from village to village. The expected defections of South Vietnamese did not materialize, and the Viet Cong had to fight with whatever little they had left after all the resources they spent just getting across the border to the South Vietnamese towns. Reporters accompanying the American troops were stunned about the suddenness and the ferocity of the North Vietnamese assault. General Westmoreland, who had thought that the Khe Sanh attack was the big one, was probably more surprised than anyone else. Still, he bravely tried to put a positive spin on the shock attack by telling reporters that the deceitful plans were not working. Still, the reporters were streaming harrowing combat images on television and newspapers. While the Johnson administration kept on publicly saying that the North Vietnamese were losing, the Viet Cong were still in the streets, killing Americans and South Vietnamese on a regular basis. The most shocking images were the attacks on Saigon, which everyone thought was safe from enemy incursions. Outside of Saigon, North Vietnamese forces were successful in capturing some villages, then using loudspeakers to persuade the inhabitants and some ARVN troops to abandon the South Vietnamese government and join their cause. They went from house to house to look for known South Vietnamese sympathizers and even raised the NLF flags in villages they believed they had conquered. However, the mass defections that they had hoped for did not materialize, especially from students and educated people they believed was instrumental to a total revolution. Back at the White House, Johnson was just as shocked as his generals when he was informed that Saigon, of all places, was being shelled by mortar fire. To the new Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford, it was a baptism of fire. The military installations of the South Vietnamese, the American embassy, and even the presidential palace were heavily shelled, revealing a big weakness in U.S. military intelligence. Still, President Johnson maintained that there would be no change in strategy despite the North Vietnamese assault. The North Vietnamese, on the other hand, also did not fare that well. The anticipated mass defection of South Vietnamese people did not materialize, and they eventually were forced to withdraw their forces, suffering a major loss in manpower, equipment, and morale. While President Johnson touted the North Vietnamese withdrawal as a success, most U.S. lawmakers felt that if the Viet Cong assault was considered a failure, they hoped that they never see a Viet Cong success given the damage they caused. A hostage situation in Korea compounded Johnson's woes as the press covered it extensively, adding to the bad press that the Tet Offensive generated, especially in Saigon, where the press congregated. The media also speculated that he was leaning towards relieving Westmoreland of his command, a suggestion that Johnson vehemently denied. He then turned on the media, suggesting that they were unpatriotic and was harming the war effort. After 10 days, the Viet Cong decided to abandon Saigon, their hopes of a grandiose takeover blunted by the overwhelming American artillery and their ability to rally the South Vietnamese citizenry to their cause. In the process of winning back Saigon and the other villages, however, American forces and the ARVN run roughshod over the people and the infrastructure. Houses and crops were destroyed, innocent civilians killed, and there were reports of American servicemen raping women or using sea rations to pay young women for sex. On March 2nd, the Tet Offensive was considered to have been officially repulsed. 221 Americans were dead and 1,364 badly injured. Enemy losses could not be accurately determined, but their death numbered in the thousands. Walter Cronkite, a preeminent television newsman of his day, filed his own report on television and told millions of viewers that he was sickened by the death and mayhem he witnessed during the Tet Offensive. He added that the major battles did not seem to bring Americans closer to victory, despite the loss of many lives and billions of dollars in military expenditure. Johnson conceded that because he lost the trust of Cronkite, he had effectively lost his country's as well. Despite the haunting images delivered by the press, Johnson saw the retreat of the Viet Cong as evidence that the enemy could be vanquished. As polls showed a big majority of Americans still looking forward to a victory, he authorized sending over 200,000 more men over the rest of 1968, and then calling up 280,000 reservists. With the coming election that year, Johnson was walking a fine line between being seen as weak by not sending the troops or ineffective because the Americans had not shown significant progress in the 3 years of fighting. As Johnson was foundering politically, Congress demanded a congressional review of American Vietnam policy, and a bitter but extremely popular critic, Robert F. Kennedy, JFK's younger brother, decided to contest Johnson to be the Democratic presidential candidate in 1968. Kennedy accused the president that his brother's guerrilla war in Vietnam had been transformed into a full-blown war with little oversight by Congress. To appease some critics, he relieved General Westmoreland of his command and replaced him with Creighton Abrams, but it did little to move public opinion in his favor. He convened with the wise men again to get their counsel. Johnson was shocked when they had moved 180 degrees on their position and negotiated a peace settlement to stop the war. The wise men had had enough of Vietnam, and they were, according to the Defense Secretary Clifford, sick and tired. On March 31st, 1968, Johnson went on national television to announce that he was not ordering new attacks on North Vietnam, except in places where the enemy was continuing to build up its forces. In the same telecast, he shocked the world by announcing that he was not running for re-election. On April 4th, the North Vietnamese announced that they were willing to negotiate. While Moscow backed this conciliatory stance, China was upset that North Vietnam was even considering compromise with the United States. On the same day, thousands of miles away, more shockwaves would ensue as Martin Luther King Jr. would be assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. The racial undertones of his assassination would carry over the Vietnam battlefield, as the increasing number of black soldiers being recruited created a color barrier within America's fighting ranks. King's death did nothing to silence the growing opposition to the war, as the anti-war sentiment crept into American campuses. After over a month of negotiations over where the peace talks were to be held, the parties decided on Paris, where weeks would pass by without any progress. In the meantime, the North Vietnamese continued their guerrilla attacks, attempting to penetrate as deeply into the center of each village and city. Despite their deceit and stealth, they continued to suffer losses because of American and ARVN resistance. Ultimately, to the American people, things were looking more like a stalemate than anything else. When over 2,400 American soldiers were killed in May 1968, the bloodiest month of the war, a Gallup poll showed that for the first time, almost half of all Americans believed that getting involved in Vietnam had been a mistake. Nevertheless, things would go from bad to worse that year. On June 5, 1968, Robert Kennedy would die from gunshots inflicted by Sirhan Sirhan, a delusional Palestinian. He died the next day. The Veneer of Civilization, June 1968 to April 1969. In North Vietnam, things weren't looking much brighter. The Tet Offensive and the non-stop guerrilla incursions were causing untold deaths. It was forbidden to talk about the casualties, but those who secretly listened to foreign radio stations knew that casualties were heavy. As with Americans, the endless need for troops meant that a vast majority of new recruits were young and uneducated men. Most of the North Vietnamese troops were from villages that listened to and believed the rallying cries of communism and revolution. For the U.S. Armed Forces, the approach to the war changed under Creighton Abrams. He was more down-to-earth than the controlled and crisped Westmoreland. Abrams prohibited the tactical use or helicopter gunships, bombing, and artillery without his express permission. To him, there was just one war, whether it was engaging guerrilla forces in hand-to-hand combat, shelling fixed Vietnamese positions, a war of territorial security, a war of pacification, or a war of big battalion. The one war would still include the multifaceted approach of previous years, including the disruption of insurgent forces and the destruction of the main force units. However, what Abrams wanted most of all was to prepare the South Vietnamese forces for taking responsibility for their own independence. He knew that the days of escalation was over and that the main objective was to hold serve until the Paris peace talks could yield some substantive results, when American forces could finally withdraw. North Vietnamese forces, however, would make it harder for the Americans. They mounted another countrywide assault in August of 1968 and once again met with failure. As thousands of troops and civilians continued to die and peace talks were at a stalemate, Johnson began to wonder if calling a halt to the bombing was a good idea. He was hoping that the South Vietnamese would shoulder more of the load. As if prompted, South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu signed the General Mobilization Law, which called for the mobilization of up to 1 million men. President Johnson's people were not impressed. All that top officials could see were top generals fighting among themselves as they maneuvered for political and economic gains. They knew that South Vietnam did not want to end the war because the golden flow of money from their looting of the populace through corruption and theft was protected by 500,000 American troops. Secretary of Defense Clifford was therefore aghast that Johnson was thinking of expanding troop presence in Vietnam to pressure Hanoi into caving into U.S. military might. The Democratic Party, which had to look for a new presidential candidate, was deeply divided. The frontrunner by default was Vice President Hubert Humphrey, whose main problem was that he immediately linked as to support of Johnson in his increasingly unpopular war. The party campaign war chest was empty, and Humphrey was unable to buy a single television or radio spot. In public appearances, his speeches were constantly drowned out by chants of fascist, dump the hump. He had to face a rowdy Democratic National Convention where most Americans, especially Democrats, wanted America out of Vietnam for good. The rifts in the party were magnified by violence and police brutality in the days leading to the convention in Chicago in the fall of 1968, where police, under the direction of the rough and tumble Democrat Chicago mayor Richard J. Dowley, seemed intent to brutalize protesters. Before the convention, Humphrey was 15 points behind in the polls, behind his Republican rival, Richard Nixon. His advisors counseled that he had to break with President in supporting American participation in the war and urged for a quick withdrawal of American forces. On September 27, 1968, he delivered a speech in Salt Lake City outlining exactly that. A stunned and betrayed Lyndon Johnson wondered aloud whether Nixon would make a better president. With the U.S. elections approaching, the United States refused to send in more troops as it was losing its patience with Thieu, whose corrupt government was unable to gain control of the countryside. To address this, the CIA created the Phoenix program to begin a program called Accelerated Pacification. The program called for a reversal of the workings of what the CIA called Viet Cong infrastructure. This was an informal process where local village chiefs, spies, runners, suppliers, and tax collectors worked with NLF troops to aid in their war against the Americans. As advisors, the Americans watched as South Vietnamese Provincial Reconnaissance Units, or PRUs, inserted themselves deep into village politics and operations. While there were abuses such as the violent settling of old scores, it was successful in showing the advance of Viet Cong influence among the local population. This success was grudgingly acknowledged by Hanoi after the war. However, all that the Phoenix success accomplished was to cause a small dent in the North Vietnamese armor. Polls among the South Vietnamese showed that Thieu and the Americans were viewed less favorably than any other faction, including 20% for the NLF. After all, the communists were effective leaders with an ideology, which meant that they could more easily instill more commitment and discipline. In Paris, American negotiators were becoming more optimistic that a peace deal could be reached if the U.S. stopped its bombing of North Vietnam. The Americans would do this if North Vietnam agreed to the facts of life about South Vietnam. The most important of these was to recognize South Vietnam as a full partner in the peace talks. They also demanded that the shelling of South Vietnam cities should be dropped, and that they should respect the neutrality of the DMZ. Knowing that polls showed that Americans had favored peace talks more than any other means to end the war, Nixon made sure that the peace talks did not happen until he was president. His team deployed Anna Chan Chano, a wealthy Vietnamese Republican donor, to convince Thieu to refuse to participate in the peace talks until after the election, effectively shutting down further progress in the negotiations. When the Paris peace talks were about to begin on November 6, 1968, days before the presidential election, it was evident that Chano's lobbying of Thieu worked. Thieu said that he was not going to be a party to the peace talks. Johnson smelled a rat and viewed Chano's meddling as an act of treason. She was never charged, and Nixon went on to win the presidency of the United States. With the presidential elections out of the way, Nixon began his full assault on trying to end U.S. involvement in the war, starting with the scheduling of new talks in Paris just days after his inauguration. His envoy would be his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who had already echoed the American dilemma in Vietnam. The government was hopefully corrupt, and South Vietnamese were increasingly troubled by American intervention and presence in their country. Many villages began to empty as people poured into Saigon, whose population had tripled to 3 million since the Americans settled there just a few years back. It became a poster city for urban blight with hundreds of thousands of beggars, prostitutes, scavengers, and thieves. The lure of Americans and their spending appealed to the villagers, who figured that life was easier in Saigon than in the villages where violence and disaster were norm. With urban blight came corruption, and officials sold their posts and influence, and received and made payoffs to obtain special privileges. Richard Nixon was not going to be a party to the South Vietnamese swamp. He vowed that he would be the public face of stopping U.S. involvement in Vietnam, and fast. His avowed goal was to obtain and maintain peace at home, but like Johnson before him, the Vietnam War would intrude into his plans. But since he believed that domestic affairs pretty much took care of themselves, he could spend more time on Vietnam, this time focusing on ending it and getting out as soon as practicable. Vietnam had been reduced to a guerrilla war, where the guerrilla wins if he does not lose, and America could not be seen to be the perpetual loser with no divisive victories. While Nixon and Kissinger did not always agree on how to prosecute the war, they knew that the following had to be achieved. Intensify the pacification of the North Vietnamese as Operation Phoenix was doing, and then strengthen the South Vietnamese forces while slowly withdrawing the American presence. Nixon and Kissinger coined this Vietnamization, which he wanted to announce together with an order for the initial withdrawal of American troops. The Paris peace talks, however, ground to a halt when Hanoi demanded that Thieu be deposed and that the United States withdraw from South Vietnam unilaterally. Nixon countered by saying that Thieu could only be removed by a free election process. As he prepared for the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, with Moscow, he was confident that he could also ask Russia to ask Hanoi to back down a little on their demands. What added to Nixon's optimism was that Hanoi's two leaders, Ho Chi Minh and Le Duan, were quickly advancing in age and would be eager to give up the ghost. In actuality, however, the opposite was true. Ho and Le Duan had fought too long and sacrificed too much to give up their struggle at the drop of a hat. They knew that if they waited just a little more, the American people would simply be fed up once and for all and ask their leaders to unilaterally withdraw from South Vietnam. Thieu be damned. Ultimately, Kissinger and Nixon had miscalculated. Moscow did not have the clout to influence Hanoi and tell them to soften up. Instead of backing down, North Vietnam on February 22, 1969, launched a series of attacks from neighboring Cambodia, which killed over 1,100 soldiers in a 2-week period. A month later, Nixon ordered the bombing of North Vietnamese sanctuaries in neutral Cambodia, which was unknown to B-52 bomber pilots until their course was directed by ground-based radar. The White House denied that they had bombed Cambodia, and it was clear to Nixon that a negotiated peace was not imminent. The History of the World, May 1969 to December 1970. Richard Nixon knew that he needed to do something new if he wanted to end the war that had led to the failure of Lyndon Johnson's presidency. He maintained that Thieu was an able leader and that the war was not being lost in Vietnam, but in the United States. The reality was that the American people no longer wanted to support indefinitely the South Vietnamese government, who did not seem capable of supporting itself, and was under constant siege by communists wanting total control of Vietnam. Even as Nixon touted his Vietnamization, Thieu had non-negotiable conditions. There would be no coalition government, no Communist Party in South Vietnam, or surrender territorial integrity. This was mirrored by the North Vietnamese, who were never going to walk away from the Paris talks with two Vietnams. They had also developed a new battle strategy that buoyed their confidence. Instead of the failed major offensives like the Tet and subsequent attacks, they would instead use a series of smaller attacks that would weaken the enemy until it would culminate in a final kill. In May 1969, Nixon made it clear that either by force or by withdrawal, the United States would be out of Vietnam in 3 years or less. General Abrams himself set the deadline for withdrawing the troops as June 30, 1972, before the presidential elections and congressional elections. This seemed possible at the time, as the accelerated pacification program that the CIA hatched in the previous year was negatively affecting the NLF, which lessened the need for American firepower. Not all of the commanders, however, agreed with Abrams' directive to cut back on military attacks. They argued that unrestrained use of firepower saved countless American lives. They needed as much as they can get to engage the NLF in places such as Hill 937, Dong Ap Bia, or the Mountain of the Crouching Beast. It would be infamously remembered as Hamburger Hill, where many Americans and South Vietnamese would be killed. In the fall of 1969, it would be the scene of the last major battle, where body count would be used as the measure of battle success. Despite his initial wish to not withdraw forces unilaterally, the glacial pace in which the peace talks were moving announced that 25,000 troops would leave Vietnam by August 1969, and maybe another 80,000 more by year's end. He was inclined to withdraw even before South Vietnam was ready to defend itself, violating the second part of his own Vietnamization proposal. Melvin Laird, his Secretary of Defense, warned that once U.S. troops started coming home, Americans would demand for more. Withdrawing too quickly would also compromise dwindling numbers of American troops left behind, expose underprepared Vietnamese forces to systematic attacks by enemy forces, and leave the Vietnamese forces left behind totally incapable of protecting South Vietnam in the long term. Nixon tried to appease Thieu in the meantime. He promised him that the United States would be around for 8 years, culminating with 4 years of economic Vietnamization after 4 years of military Vietnamization. He added that North Vietnamese forces would be long gone before these 8 years were over. Thieu was concerned that no matter what the timetable was, Vietnam would end up like the Koreas, with a DMZ separating the communist North from his South. Finally, Nixon planned to meet formally with Thieu on Midway Island to publicly reaffirm the solidarity between U.S. and South Vietnam, showing the U.S. commitment to Vietnamization. In the meantime, anti-Thieu factions hastily gathered near the Cambodian border to form a counterattack to the Thieu regime. They named it the Provisional Revolutionary Government, PRG, and aimed to supplant the NLF contingent in the Paris peace talks. As NLF main force units guarded the meeting's principals agreed that the great reliance on the North was weakening any Southern flavor that insurgents were trying to develop. North Vietnamese Prime Minister Pham Van Dong and Ho Chi Minh himself endorsed the plan and hastily sent telegrams that declared the PRG as the true representative and legal government of South Vietnam. Within a couple of days, Beijing, Moscow, and other communist allies followed suit. While the peace talks were moving along unsuccessfully, the United States made its first ever mass withdrawal of troops on July 8, 1969, when 814 soldiers boarded a flight out of Nutt Air Force Base towards McChord Air Base in Tacoma, Washington. They were the first of the 25,000 soldiers who would go home as promised by the president. Many commanders were not happy with the prospects of random withdrawals. They argued that breaking up units that had fought together for a long time would harm those units' battle effectiveness, which could translate to higher troop mortality. To help reduce these casualties, the U.S. began spraying 1/4 of South Vietnam and border areas of Cambodia and Laos with a chemical called Agent Orange to kill the foliage that provided cover for the Viet Cong. Nixon ordered the cessation of the herbicide, but not after massive ecological damage had already been inflicted on the country. Disinfectation would run deep in all sectors of the American people in 1969. Young people did not want to get drafted, even as many joined a growing number of protesters on college campuses. Racial divisions within troop units were becoming more pronounced, while incidents of soldiers blowing up their own commanders with grenades were reported. As Nixon started pulling out troops, soldiers began to wonder why they were still fighting a war that nobody wanted to win, and troop morale was at its lowest point. Many soldiers also just decided not to fight. When they just got out of sight from their commanders, they would settle somewhere safe and report that they were looking for and engaging the enemy while they were sweeping jungles, crossing streams, and climbing hills. They would pretend to be soldiering while they waited for helicopters to pick them up. Starting in the late 1969, the U.S., while withdrawing troops steadily, also was supplying its existing troops and the South Vietnamese with more armaments and terrifying air support. The unintended effect was to keep the South Vietnamese forces reliant on American military power, which stunted any effort to transform them into an independent and self-reliant force. South Vietnamese military chiefs did not want the American military to leave, as their presence masked not only their ineffectiveness, but provided cover and financing for their corrupt activities. The presence of many enemy agents, as many as 30,000 in the estimation of the CIA, added to the increasingly untenable tension on American forces. Desperate for some form of resolution, Nixon dispatched Kissinger to a secret meeting in Paris on August 4, 1969, to speak with North Vietnamese negotiators. Kissinger gave them a hard deadline when they would need to remove their forces from South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese flat out refused. In less than a month, the father and the spirit of the North Vietnamese insurgency, Ho Chi Minh, would die on September 2nd. Hopes that his death would lead to some sort of softening by the North Vietnamese were quickly dashed. Threats of massive bombing forays did not scare off the North Vietnamese. In the US, huge demonstrations were taking place, and Nixon could see that most of the country was coalescing towards American withdrawal from Vietnam. This was aggravated by the divulging of the details in November 1969 of the My Lai massacre, which happened almost 2 years earlier. The wholesale murder of over 300 innocent and unarmed women, children, and elderly people shocked the whole world and gave teeth to the anti-war demonstrations. Among the protests was a violent uprising in Kent State, where National Guard troopers fired on and killed students who were protesting the war. These events put Nixon and the US in a more negative light than ever before, so more had to be done. On April 19, 1970, Nixon announced that 150,000 troops would be returning home over a 12-month period, the biggest troop withdrawal to that point, but it would not be enough. A disrespectful loyalty. January 1971 to March 1973. As 1971 approached, the Paris talks were going nowhere, whether it was the public or secret meetings. According to the National Security Council, there was no way the US could force North Vietnam to leave South Vietnam either by force or through negotiations. The US needed another approach. Together with South Vietnamese General Cao Van Vien, General Abrams drew up a plan to attack NLF forces in Cambodia. This would be in direct violation of a new law that was passed the previous December that barred using American troops in Cambodia or Laos. Instead, America would provide air and artillery support to surprise NLF forces who they hoped to blindside. They had hoped that a 4-point plan would culminate in a mop-up operation by elite commando units before leaving the area by mid-April of 1971. It turned out to be another setback for Vietnamese who were forced to fight a ground battle without American advisors. Only American artillery fire and helicopter cover kept from turning it into a total disaster. It was a sobering turn of events that showed that Vietnamization, as Nixon had envisioned, would be difficult if not downright impossible. The media continued to be confused and skeptical of the administration's plan to continue the war. To try to win some confidence back for the South Vietnamese, they staged a bogus victory war in Khe Sanh, which spoke to the desperation of the Nixon administration to show that somehow his Vietnamization push was working. But another supposedly winnable battle proved to be a disaster for the South Vietnamese. Operation Lam Son 719, which began in February 1971, was supposed to showcase the vast improvements of the South Vietnamese army. Instead, the incursion into Laos without on-the-field American help led to the most deadly battle for South Vietnam. Almost 10,000 dead, wounded, or missing, which was half of the total men initially deployed. Hanoi was quick to declare victory, which was apparent by any objective measure. The battle, which lasted over a month, was used by Nixon to proclaim that Vietnamization was working despite the lopsided losses. Because of this apparent victory, he announced a few days after the operation ended that he would be withdrawing 100,000 troops before the end of the year. In a private conversation with Kissinger, however, he said that if nothing fruitful came out of the Paris talks soon, he would bomb the bastards right out of the earth. In the US, a protest wave appeared in the country for the first time in its history. War veterans joined in protesters against a war that was currently being waged. Hundreds of veterans, including future Senator and presidential candidate John Kerry, not only marched in protest against the war, they also made a show of discarding the medals that they had earned during the Vietnam War. While an overwhelming majority of Americans disapproved of their actions, the protesting veterans showed that the war was turning a new page in American history. In June 1971, the first real confrontation between the press and the White House ensued when the New York Times published parts of the Pentagon Papers, a 7,000-page report from the Rand Corporation commissioned by former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. The report showed that while President Kennedy and Johnson had deep reservations about winning the war, they continued to press for its escalation. It also showed that American officials were deeply skeptical about the abilities and integrity of the men who were running the South Vietnamese government, but decided to prop themselves up. After the government sought to suppress further publication, the U.S. Supreme Court, on June 30th, 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court allowed the publishing of other portions of the document, even if it was stolen by an insider in the Pentagon on worked-on papers, Daniel Ellsberg. In the meantime, Nixon decided that he would use clandestine techniques to learn more about his enemies and created a private investigation team in the White House to burglarize and secretly infiltrate the offices and files of those who Nixon considered enemies. They came to be known as the Plumbers. They broke into offices of Ellsberg and Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. in a fruitless search for other compromising information they could recover. The Plumbers would prominently figure in a national scandal 2 years later as they would break into the Democratic campaign headquarters at the Watergate Hotel, leading to events which would lead to Nixon's resignation as president. Nixon wanted to get as much Vietnam off his presidential plate before the coming elections in 1972. In both public and private summits, the North wanted two concessions. The easier one was that North Vietnam wanted some reparations for the extensive damage from the U.S. bombings. The issue seemed easily resolved since diplomats could word how payments could be made without really meeting North Vietnam's sizable demands. The other issue was trickier because North Vietnam wanted the ouster of Nguyen Van Thieu in favor of a PRG leader favored by Hanoi. The Thieu issue became thornier when he won election in October 1971 in what was considered a sham election. When Nixon announced his plans to visit China, the Soviets, who had increasingly become hostile to Beijing, began sending massive amounts of military aid and state-of-the-art armaments to North Vietnam. With the new armaments, the proven ineffectiveness of ARVN troops, and the increasing withdrawal of U.S. troops, North Vietnam planned another assault on South Vietnam. This time it would be an all-out conventional assault without reliance on the defection of South Vietnamese that may or may not materialize. On March 30th, 1972, they surprised the South Vietnamese with a vicious attack, coinciding with the absence of top U.S. commanders, including General Abrams. The North Vietnamese would call the attack the Summer of the Flames, while the Americans would refer to it as the Easter Offensive. It would go on for 3 months and turn out to be the longest siege of the war. Despite the upgraded military capabilities of the Communists, Nixon ordered more troops withdraw. In July, the North Vietnamese staged another attack, which was more quickly repelled with the help of American bombers. After the dust had settled, over 5,000 South Vietnamese troops would perish, with the North Vietnamese estimated to suffer at least twice that many troop deaths. After Nixon visited China and Moscow in the summer of 1972, he authorized the launch of Operation Linebacker, a massive bombing assault on North Vietnamese strongholds. This operation was the first time the U.S. military would be using electronically guided bombs and missiles, ushering a new kind of warfare. The bombings would continue throughout the year even as peace talks between Hanoi and the U.S. continued. In November, Nixon would win re-election easily and now felt it was time to go on all-out campaign to leave Vietnam. In the peace talks, which amazingly did not include any South Vietnamese government representatives, Hanoi and the U.S. came to terms. The agreement called for a ceasefire, after which all U.S. forces would withdraw, and all American POWs would be released within 60 days. Instead of having Thieu ejected, North Vietnam agreed to create tripartite electoral commissions, which would be comprised of Thieu's government, a neutralist faction, and the PRG. Thieu was furious that he was not consulted about the negotiations, and, as a result, he refused to sign on the agreement. For the next few months, when Thieu was refusing to sign off on the agreement, the U.S. went on a massive bombing assault, countered by large-scale attacks by NLF ground troops. Thieu was giving a deadline by Nixon to sign on the agreement by September 20, 1973, or the U.S. would proceed with signing the agreement anyway without Thieu's agreement. Despite his months of refusal, Thieu finally signed the agreement on that date. On the 22nd, the man who had led the Vietnam War and his political career, Lyndon B. Johnson, died. The following night, 28 years after the U.S. first involvement with Vietnam, Nixon finally announced that it was pulling out. The weight of memory. March 1973 to April 1975. With the Americans withdrawing, many expected that the violence would end, even if many American veterans were dubious. The North Vietnamese violated many peace treaty provisions driven by their desire not only for a unified and communist Vietnam, but mostly from their contempt of Thieu, who continued to stand by his four no's. The most prominent was for communists not to have any role in South Vietnamese politics. Less than a month after the peace treaty was signed, there were over 3,000 violations of the peace treaty by both sides. However, Hanoi was very careful in not overstepping their contravention of the peace treaty, if only to avoid calamitous US B-52 bombings. In the spring of 1973, things began to change as Nixon began to lose his grip on the presidency because of the growing Watergate scandal. The U.S. Congress passed the War Powers Act, which required previous notification of if the U.S. military was going to be used to engage in conflict in any part of the world. However, Thieu had inflated the strengths of his own forces while still believing that American bombers would be available with a phone call. However, South Vietnam without the Americans was on the verge of collapse. With the U.S. military forces gone, South Vietnam was suddenly without $400 million in American spending every year. Every economic indicator spelled disaster. A 20% unemployment rate, decline in wages, and constant devaluation of its currency. These dire conditions were made worse by omnipresent corruption by civilian authorities, many of whom were relatives or friends of Thieu. While the Nixon administration tried to brush off the corruption by comparing it to turn-of-the-century Boston, corrupt officials, most of South Vietnam suffered horrendous economic hardships, especially the poor. The military defense of South Vietnam was also being severely compromised by many corrupt military personnel who made money off the sale of armaments and parts of military equipment. With all of these problems, there would be no more help forthcoming from the Americans. With Nixon's political life in its dying stages, the U.S. Congress had lost its appetite to support further Vietnamese involvement. Perhaps the biggest loser in the sudden withdrawal of the U.S. support was Thieu, who complained about all the promises that were broken after his meeting with Nixon in Midway just a few years earlier. The U.S. was not only withdrawing its troops, it had also stopped providing bombing cover and artillery support against the constant attacks by the North Vietnamese. While impeachment proceedings were being mauled against Nixon, there were South Vietnamese counterparts from all sectors demanding that Thieu step down. When Nixon finally resigned from the presidency in August of 1975, Thieu practically abandoned all hope of retaining his power. Le Duan and the North Vietnamese, sensing that Thieu was quickly losing control of his government, did not want to wait much longer to topple Thieu's regime. Its generals ordered test attacks to find out if American bombers would come back in retaliation. Because new American Gerald Ford was preoccupied with other pressing domestic and foreign issues, no retaliation was forthcoming. By December 1974, the Communists were taking control of provinces north of Saigon. In his first State of the Nation address a month later, Ford did not mention the word Vietnam even once. By March of 1975, the North Vietnamese had the ARVN on the run, and they were quickly degrading the South Vietnamese forces. Sensing imminent victory, the Politburo ordered communist forces in South Vietnam to make the once-in-a-thousand-years opportunity to overrun Saigon before the rains came by the end of April. Ford sent General Audie Wayland to Vietnam to assure him of military support, although it was too late because the American B-52 bombers would not resume their fearsome assaults. On March 29, the Communists entered South Vietnam's largest city, Da Nang, which folded into itself in surrender. While the U.S. ambassador to Vietnam, Graham Martin, was publicly announcing that Saigon was immune from communist attack, the Americans began putting together a plan to evacuate 200,000 loyal South Vietnamese and their families together with the remaining Americans in the city. By April 1975, practically all the Americans had fled Saigon. In the first few days of April, the North Vietnamese had assumed control of Cam Ranh Bay as they continued their unstoppable march towards Saigon. General Wayland informed President Ford that the situation had become extremely critical and that there was no choice but to evacuate all Americans from Saigon. Later that month, President Ford asked Congress for $200 million for humanitarian aid for the Vietnamese and to keep the 6,000 Americans who were to be left behind safe from North Vietnamese aggression. Things turned from bad to worse as North Vietnam started to overrun the highways and surrounding villages around Saigon. Congress subsequently authorized funds for the evacuation of Americans, but not the Vietnamese. The difficulties of the US in Vietnam were then suddenly muddled by the takeover of the Khmer Rouge of Cambodia, and it was clear that the US could no longer ensure peace and tranquility in Indochina. As a result, the defense of Saigon was replaced by a new American objective of evacuating Americans and friendly Chinese. The U.S. Congress finally approved $327 million for this purpose, and a frantic evacuation protocol was put into play. It was time for the U.S. to flee. On April 25, 1975, Thieu fled to Taiwan, and 2 days later, rockets were fired into Saigon for the first time in 5 years, leading to the destruction of 5,000 homes. A seemingly never-ending flurry of helicopters flew in and out of Saigon to fly out all Americans and hundreds of lucky South Vietnamese. At 8 a.m. on April 30th, the last American helicopter would fly from the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon with dozens of Vietnamese citizens. 4 hours later, South Vietnam was no more, and the United States-Vietnam drama was over. In an address to military students in 1879, celebrated U.S. Army General William Tecumseh Sherman said, "I've seen cities and homes in ashes. I've seen thousands of men lying on the ground, their dead faces looking up into the skies. I tell you, war is hell." Just less than 100 years later, the world would understand exactly what General Sherman meant, as they would be horrified by the images, sounds, and print accounts of the first major war to be covered by the mass media. Right after the last helicopter flew the last evacuees on April 25, 1975, many expected the country to devolve into a bloodbath of retribution by the communists and a violent rejection by the Southists against them. Neither occurred. Instead, over 1 million South Vietnamese were put into camps for beginning indoctrination. It became apparent the last 5 years of vicious fighting arose from the visceral hate that Vietnamese, including some from the South, harbored for the Americans and the corrupt regime of Nguyen Van Thieu. Eventually, Vietnamese from either side of the border saw each other as simply Vietnamese, devoid of any allegiances either way. Eventually, the Vietnamese would involve themselves in Cambodian affairs. With the help of the Soviets, they would engage the Khmer Rouge in neighboring Cambodia in another guerrilla-style battle, which would lead to another 50,000 Vietnamese deaths. This engagement was often called Vietnam's Vietnam. The biggest victim was the Vietnamese economy after the Americans left. Stalinist principles for command and centralized economy failed miserably. It quickly became a third world country, while 400,000 of the Vietnamese refugees who escaped to America collectively enjoyed much more economic success operating within the American system. Ken Burns and Geoffrey Ward creating the sweeping anthology of events, using Burns' specialized skill in transforming images, testimonials, and documentary evidence into a coherent narrative that is generally free of personal or political bias. Their narrative details the staggering cost of war that in hindsight the United States should have never been involved in. Over 1 million Vietnamese troops from both sides died during the war, together with over 600,000 civilian deaths. The momentary and social costs were immeasurable, as no one could really tally how much entire villages and communities cost. For the U.S., the toll was over 58,000 dead, 160,000 injured, and hundreds of thousands more who either committed suicide or suffered psychological problems after the war. It is estimated that the cost of the Vietnam War in current dollars is around $1 trillion. The war was waged by 3 U.S. presidents from both parties. The biggest lesson that one walks away with after reading this impressive book is that the lessons of hatred, death, and destruction arising from war continue to be ignored by leaders of many countries then and since. It may just be that war is just as essential to human existence as peace and cooperation. After all, if there is a heaven, Tecumseh Sherman's hell may forever be with us.